Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're getting into the really complex legacy of President Richard Nixon.
We are, and we're using a specific analysis to guide us. It's called President Richard Nixon, A Balanced Legacy with Impact Ratings by Levnu Moten, Ph.D.
Right, and what jumps out immediately, I think, is the author's personal introduction. It's quite revealing.
It really is. He sets the stage by calling Nixon a tragic figure. He feels Nixon was, treated unfairly by the media, by the establishment.
Which led to his resignation. And he even says that resignation somehow sort of elevated Nixon in his view. Like it proves something was wrong in how he was treated.
Exactly. It's a strong perspective to start with. He even mentions how someone like Donald Trump, in his view, used modern media tools to defend himself in ways Nixon just couldn't.
So that personal angle is key. The author basically says, look, I want to get past all the negative stuff that's been said for years and focus on the actual positive impact, the long-term positive imprint of Nixon's policies.
Both domestically and internationally. So our task here is to unpack those policies, look at their rated impact from this analysis, but always keep that author's initial viewpoint, that sort of tragic figure idea, in the back of our minds.
Okay, so how does he rate these things? What's the method?
Well, he uses a scale from Elasta 100, which would be an extreme failure, up to plus 100, a transformative success.
And that rating is based on?
It considers a few things. The scope, how big the impact was, how long the effects lasted, and its historical significance. And he does this separately for domestic stuff and international policy.
Got it. So let's dig into the domestic side first. The Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, 1970, gets a huge score, plus 95.
Yeah, described as a landmark, enduring bipartisan support, massive impact on health, environment. It's foundational, really.
Hard to argue with that one's lasting impact.
And right alongside it, I've got the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act amendments. Both score plus 90.
Also major environmental legislation.
Absolutely. The analysis calls them strong, effective, central to federal environmental rules. Big stuff.
Okay, then things get a bit more nuanced. Wage and price controls from 71, that gets a plus 25.
Right. Seen as maybe providing some short-term relief, but the analysis says it caused, harmful distortions in the long run.
A classic policy trade-off, maybe?
Could be. Contrast that with ending the gold standard, the Nixon shock, also 71. That gets a plus 75.
Much higher. Why?
The author sees it as revolutionary, actually pivotal for modern economics. Controversial for sure, but ultimately a necessary, transformative move for the global economy.
Interesting. Okay, what else on the domestic front?
OSHA? Occupational Safety and Health Administration, another high one, plus 90. Big impact on improving workplace safety for millions, and it's lasted.
So environment, economy, workplace safety. Quite a range.
And civil rights, too. Accelerated desegregation of southern schools gets a plus 90.
That one feels underappreciated sometimes.
The author thinks so. Calls it effective enforcement, using federal power to really push desegregation forward, even though it wasn't popular everywhere at the time.
What about things that didn't quite happen?
Like the Family Assistance Plan, FAP. It gets a plus 50. It failed in Congress, but the author sees it as, forward-thinking. A glimpse of a different approach to welfare reform. Shows policy imagination, I suppose.
Okay. And one more domestic.
Supplemental Security Income, SSI. Rated plus 75. A quieter program, maybe, but provides long-term income support for elderly, blind, disabled populations. Really significant for those groups.
So pretty substantial domestic agenda looking at those scores. Now, shifting internationally.
Yeah.
The China visit, 1972.
That gets the perfect plus 100. You can't really overstate its importance, can you?
No, transformative is the right word. It just completely realigned global power dynamics.
Totally. And then détente with the Soviet Union, the Saltai Treaty, also very high, plus 95.
The first major arms control agreement.
Yeah.
Huge for reducing Cold War tension.
Exactly. A critical step back from the brink, you could say.
What about Vietnam? That's obviously looms large.
It does. The Vietnamization policy and the Paris Peace Accords both get a plus 60.
So positive, but not as high as China or SALTA 1.
Right. The thinking is Vietnamization did reduce U.S. casualties, helped get troops out, but ultimately, South Vietnam still fell.
And the Paris Peace Accords ended the direct U.S. involvement.
But didn't bring lasting peace. So a qualified success, maybe. It ended America's war, but not the war. Highlights the difficulty, doesn't it?
Definitely. Okay, one more internationally. Support for Israel in the 73 Yom Kippur War. That gets a plus 80.
Framed here as a key strategic decision. Strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship, solidified the U.S. role in the Middle East, Still relevant today, obviously.
So again, really significant impacts on the world stage according to this analysis.
Absolutely. But it wasn't all successes, even leaving Watergate aside for a second.
Right. Economic stagflation. We mentioned the controls earlier, but the overall economic picture, that gets an AGA 40.
Yeah, a major failure noted here. Couldn't control inflation and unemployment at the same time, led to stagnation, economic pain.
Then another negative. Expansion of executive power, rated negative 20.
This touches on concerns about, the imperial presidency.
Right.
Using executive authority in ways that maybe weaken checks and balances. Still a debate we have today, isn't it?
Very much so. And then there's the bombing in Cambodia and Laos, a really dark chapter.
And it gets a very low score, negative 60. The analysis highlights how secret it was, how destabilizing, the humanitarian cost.
Yeah.
Just deeply problematic.
Okay. So that brings us, inevitably, to Watergate. How does the analysis handle that? It's treated separately.
Yes, separately evaluated. The scandal itself, the abuse of power, obstruction of justice, all of it gets a negative 50. A clear condemnation, loss of trust, damage to institutions.
But then there's a twist, right? The aftermath.
Kind of surprising. Nixon's resignation gets a plus 40.
Plus 40? Why positive?
The argument is that by resigning, he avoided a much deeper, potentially paralyzing constitutional crisis. It showed, maybe under duress, but still showed some acceptance of accountability. It's a very complex take on it.
Wow, okay. So the conclusion on Watergate is?
That it rightly overshadows a lot. It's a huge stain, but it shouldn't completely erase everything else he did, positive or negative.
And this is where the author brings back his initial point about the media.
Exactly. He gives a plus 50 rating to this idea he calls media and defenselessness. He really doubles down on the idea that Nixon lacked the modern tools to push back against a hostile press narrative. A contextual disadvantage, he calls it.
It ties back directly to that tragic figure framing from the introduction.
It absolutely does. It reinforces his view that there's a narrative about Nixon that he feels is incomplete or unfair.
So, pulling it all together, what are the final scores in this analysis?
Okay, so the weighted average for domestic policy comes out to plus 43.
Positive, but not overwhelming.
Right. International policy, though, is much higher, a weighted average of plus 79.
Reflecting things like China and détente.
Precisely. And the overall legacy score, excluding Watergate, based on this methodology, lands at plus 61.
Still positive overall if you set Watergate aside for that calculation.
Yes. And the author's final thoughts really emphasize Nixon's lasting impact foreign policy, EPA, OSHA, the regulatory state, seeing him as this strategic mind, maybe ahead of his time, but undone by his own flaws, his ambition, with Watergate as that permanent mark against him.
So quite a journey through this specific lens on Nixon. We started with the author's very personal take Nixon as this unfairly treated tragic figure.
And then we walked through his attempt to quantify the legacy, rating these major achievements like the EPA, opening China.
Alongside the serious failures like stagflation, the Cambodia bombings, and then this separate complex assessment of Watergate itself.
And it does make you circle back to that initial framing, doesn't it? Looking at all these scores, the pluses and the minuses. Does it make the author's tragic figure idea seem more plausible, or does it just show how incredibly complicated and, frankly, contradictory the whole picture is?
That's the question to chew on, I think. Considering the author laid out his bias, or at least his perspective, right at the start, does knowing that upfront viewpoint combined with this detailed rating analysis actually help us understand Nixon's legacy better? Or does it make it even harder to sort out?
Yeah, and what does that suggest about how we try to evaluate any historical figure, especially one as controversial as Nixon? How much does the evaluator's starting point shape the conclusion, even when they try to be objective with something like a rating system?
Definitely food for thought. A lot to unpack there beyond just the scores themselves.